Welcome everyone. I'm Father Antonio Lopez. I'm the Provost Dean of the John Paul II Institute. Welcome to this book discussion of Dr. David Schindler, The Catholicity of Reason. Right. So what I'll do now, my task is very simple today. I'll introduce the speakers, then so that you know how lucky we are today, and having these great thinkers among us. And then Dr. Schindler will present the argument of his book in a nutshell, as much as possible. And then there will be the responses of Professor William Desmond and Father Anselm Ramelow. Is that correctly pronounced? Yes. And then each one of them should be between around 20-25 minutes. After which Dr. Schindler will be able to reply to these responses, and then we probably have time for questions from all of you. So just raise your hand, and then you'll be, I guess, a microphone will be given to you so that you can ask your question and be heard. We'll have a nice reception afterwards also. Dr. David Schindler received his PhD from the Catholic University of America in 2001 with a dissertation on the philosophy of Hans Urs von Balthasar. He taught at Villanova University from 2001 to 2013, first as a teaching fellow in the philosophy department, and then in the Department of Humanities, where he received tenure in 2007. He received an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship to do research in Munich from 2007 to 2008. He's currently working on a multi-volume critique of the modern concept of freedom as the power to choose in light of a metaphysics of freedom based on actuality. As far as I know, it's a 3-volume set. Last time we spoke, 3 volumes. Professor Schindler is a translator of French and German and has served as an editor of Communio, International Catholic Review, since 2002. His other books include The Perfection of Freedom, Schiller, Schelling, and Hegel Between the Ancients and the Moderns, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, On Truth and Goodness in the Republic, Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Dramatic Structure of Truth, a philosophical investigation, and as co-editor with Ginny Herfmann Schindler, Robert Spemann Reader, Philosophical Essays on Nature, God, and the Human Person. Professor William Desmond is currently Professor of Philosophy and Director of the International Program in Philosophy at Leuven, as well as David Cook Visiting Chair at Villanova University. He is the author of 12 books, including Being and the Between, which is the winner of the Prix Cardinal Mercier and the J.N. Finlay Award for Best Book in Metaphysics, 1995-1997. Among his other books are Ethics and the Between, Hegel's God, A Counterfeit Double, Art, Origins, Otherness, Between Philosophy and Art, Is There a Sabbath for Thought Between Religion and Philosophy, God and the Between, and Being Between, Conditions of Irish Thought. He's also past president of the Hegel Society of America, 1990-1992, of the Metaphysical Society of America, from 94-95, and of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, 2006-2008. Professor Desmond's work is primarily in metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophy of religion. Lastly, Father Anselm Ramelow is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California. Having earned his doctorate from the University of Munich, he now teaches on such topics as the intersection of faith and reason, philosophical aesthetics, philosophy of language, philosophy of personhood, and the history of philosophy. He's co-editor of Theologia Ignota for Philosophia Verlag, and his books include Gott, Freiheit, Weltenwahl, Die Metaphysik der Willensfreiheitswissen, Antonio Perez, Jesuit, and Leibniz. The second one is Beyond Modernism, George Lindbeck and Linguistic Turn in Theology. His articles have appeared in Nova et Vetera, the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, Angelicum, and the Josephinum Journal of Theology. Please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight.
So I would first like to thank Father Lopez and the Institute and for hosting this event, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. It really is a privilege, a humbling privilege to be able to discuss one's work in this forum, and especially to discuss it directly with very serious philosophical minds. So I'm very grateful to William and Father Anselm both for their time in reading the book and making a very long trip out here in both cases. I got to know William at Villanova when I was teaching there the last few years, and Father Anselm graciously helped my wife and me when we were putting together the Robert Spemann reader. He's one of the esteemed students of Robert Spemann and was a great help there. So I'll begin here just giving a very brief presentation of what the point of the book is, sort of the basic conception and the fundamental problem that it attempts to sort of begin a response to. And my comments will be fairly brief so that we have time for discussion at the end. A few months after after the book was already out, I stumbled across a passage from a poem by Browning, and I think if I had discovered it earlier, it would have been the epigraph for the book. It sort of encapsulates, in a certain sense, in a nutshell, what the aim was. And the line is the following: "Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?" In a way, this captures the basic concept. It's the title is The Catholicity of Reason. It's an attempt to articulate a sense of reason precisely as Catholic, katholon, which means according to reason, according to the whole, concerning the whole, involving the whole, being ordered to the whole. And the idea of the Catholicity of Reason is this notion that it's reason is not simply an abstract functioning of the mind. It's not just a recorder of information, but reason is an act that has to proceed from the whole person, and it in order to be authentic has to seek out the whole of reality. So from the whole to the whole, in a sense, and it's only insofar as it aspires in that really comprehensive way that it opens up beyond itself to what genuinely transcends it. So it's precisely this fundamental aspiration of reason for the whole that, in a way, connects it with what you might say is extra-rational and supra-rational, both extra-rational in the sense of elements beyond the normal, our normal view of reason, our sensibility, our sense experience, imagination, and so forth, and then ultimately to the gift of faith from above and the revelation, God's own self-revelation. So reason reaches out beyond its grasp, and it's precisely for that reason that heaven makes sense. What's a heaven for? So that's the basic. The basic concept. Now, what motivated the writing of this book is a problem that I think is, in a certain sense, it's very easy to state, and it's not, I think, wouldn't be surprising to any of us here, and that is a conviction that one of the great ailments of our time is that we have a radically impoverished conception of the nature of reason. And this impoverished sense of the nature of reason both inclines us to despair over reason. We don't feel the compellingness of reason in one respect, but also in a paradoxical way that I'll explain in a moment. It makes us vulnerable to a certain kind of immanentistic thinking or oppressive kind of totalitarian sense of reasoning, paradoxically, as I'll explain in a moment. To give a sense of what I mean by this this impoverishment, I just want to point to two thoughts or experiences. One was when I was at Villanova, I was asked at one point to teach a course on faith and reason. Our department needed a course on faith and reason, so I was asked to teach that. And I began the preparation in the traditional way, I mean, in a way that I think would be obvious. I started thinking, okay, how do I make faith reasonable? How do I make it plausible? What arguments can I give that would make faith seem like a realistic possibility to the students? But as I was working on it, and based on experiences that I had had over the previous several years, it became clear to me, it sort of dawned on me, and this conviction then grew, that in a way is too late. That the biggest problem was not so much making faith plausible, but more fundamentally making reason plausible. I mean, to say that faith is rational to students who don't think that reason has any sort of weight doesn't get you anywhere. But that really presents a difficulty. How do you show? How do you prove that reason is valid? That it makes a claim? Because that's always presupposed, and you can't make an argument for it. I think what you can do. I mean that in a way is a question that I think one needs to continue exploring. But at least part of the response is to, rather than trying to justify reason, try to articulate, recover the grandeur of reason, a concept that is once again sort of returns to its original aspirations, and so that in itself is inherently attractive. Okay, so that's one thought or experience. The other is this observation that I made at a certain point, that one of the things it seems to me that most characterizes modernity is what you might call a kind of an artificial self-limitation of reason. And it struck me at a certain point that artificial self-limitation of reason actually, whereas you might think that might weaken reason's claims, it's precisely that has turned reason into kind of a totalitarian, kind of oppressive force. You might say a kind of a fascistic notion of reason. Okay, what am I talking about there? I think I can give three examples of what I mean that might illustrate that. The first is Kant's goal to set limits to reason, he says, in order to make room for faith. So notice, he's using reason to limit reason in order to open up to faith. But paradoxically, Kantian reason overtakes and completely eclipses the realm of faith. That God then in his philosophy has to justify himself to this self-limited notion of reason in order to make any sort of claim on us. And so this shrinking of the claims of reason, in a certain sense, created a barrier against the claims of faith. So instead of being modest in a way, it becomes very immodest. It becomes impenetrable. It becomes kind of self-absolutizing. Another example. If you look at in very broad terms, the history, intellectual history, it's striking to note that the moment that science, modern science, begins to encroach on all of the other disciplines and ways of interpreting the world, the moment that begins is the very moment that science relinquishes its aspiration to come to an understanding of nature. It happens the very moment science says, we're not interested in understanding, we're simply going to describe. That's when science becomes totalitarian. So again, it's this strange self-limitation that becomes absolute. And I think then third, in a kind of an analogous expression we find in the realm of politics. In the classical sense, politics was a conception of the political philosophy sought to articulate a sense of political order that entailed and fostered the flourishing of human beings in the fullness of their nature and their destiny. In the modern realm, in the modern period, political philosophy becomes instead simply a regulation of behavior for the sake of protecting self-interest. So there's a shrinking of the aspiration of politics, but what ends up happening as a result? Politics eclipses and chases everything else out from the public square, that politics in a way becomes absolute and decisive. In all those instances, what you have is a self-limitation, as I say, that becomes a self-enclosure that refuses, that cuts itself off from a connection to anything that's larger. So what you lose in each of these cases, I argue in this book, is the Catholicity of reason. That reason can subordinate itself to what's greater than itself only if it's ordered to what's greater than itself. So that it's only a reason that aspires to a complete understanding, that aspires to understand not just all of being, but the first cause of all of being, understand God himself, that finally is open to the revelation of God himself as an absolute other, as a genuine transcendent source of our knowing and our being. So that's the basic conception that lies behind the various essays here. And with that comment, I will turn the microphone over to my colleagues here.
First of all, I want to offer my thanks to Father Lopez for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I am familiar with the work of David and know him well for a number of years. I admire his work very much. It is marked by deep philosophical and theological seriousness. He shows tremendous erudition and range of scholarship, but it isn't just mere erudition. There is a systematic side to his explorations where he tries to be attentive to die Sache selbst. But then that is not merely objectivizing or neutralizing, because there's a very human sense of finesse for the living sources of philosophical and theological reflection, a passionate engagement with the ultimate questions that yet is rationally measured and poised. So the current work, the Catholicity of Reason, Catholon, as David himself just briefly referred to it, Catholicity with a small c, Catholicity with a big C. That's one of the themes of the interplay between philosophy and theology, philosophy and religion. And the question, again, for discussion, the definition of each of them for themselves, and yet the possibility of a communication or perhaps even permeability of each to the other. Now, there's a tremendous range covered in the book, and I can only just refer to a few themes, but I think at least in a first pass at the matter, I just want to draw attention to what I see are some of the significant themes in the book as a whole. I should say that the themes are classical themes, and yet they are deeply informed by a sense of modern and indeed postmodern inflections. The result, it seems to me, actually is a refreshing of the perennial themes and a fresh vision of the nature and interplay of philosophy and theology. So, a central theme, the surprise of truth, is something that David wants to defend. A certain double structure in surprise. What surprises us is in one sense, unanticipated, and yet in another sense, if we don't anticipate what is to come, we won't seek the unexpected. Heraclitus has a remark to the effect that we have to expect the unexpected. So this strange paradoxical double structure in which not knowing is yet not knowing. And there are many analyses in David's book which explore the complexity of that double structure. So there's a certain longing for truth. One of the places that David recurs to quite regularly is the discussion of truth in the Meno, Plato's Meno, where the slave is shown to somehow already possess the knowledge of certain Euclidean theorems. So Socrates is supposedly drawing it out of him. So even though we don't know the truth, somehow we are in the truth, and that in-between character of not knowing on the one hand, and yet there must be some secret sense of already being in relation to the true, because if there was not, we could neither seek nor actually recognize the true if we did in fact find it. Central, it seems to me, to the very notion of what it is to be a philosopher, particularly in the Platonic tradition, and I think that informs David's work very, very deeply. The sense of surprise, of course, relates to a beginning, but also to a sense of completion. And there are some very interesting arguments about how a sense of wonder and perhaps surprise is not dispelled in the end. There is a particular understanding of wonder, for instance, where at the beginning we're ignorant, we lack knowledge, but as we become more determinate, as our curiosity gets more articulated, we ask questions, is it this, is it that? The initial indeterminacy is progressively overcome. And in the solution to the problem, wonder itself is dispelled. We're all familiar with Aristotle's metaphysics, talking about what we all desire to know. And he couples that, of course, with a love of myth. And again, that's a theme that we could return to also in relation to logos and mythos. But also in the metaphysics, there are times when he uses the example of geometry as illustrating the nature of the original wonder. And of course, if that's our paradigm for the answer to wonder, it means that the answer itself dispels the wonder at the end. I think that in David's work, and I think this is very true to more Platonic inspirations, that the end of wonder is not the dispelling of wonder, but rather the deepening of wonder. And that part of what it means to be a philosopher, in fact, is not just simply to amass a certain collection of determinate answers to determinate problems, but somehow to dwell more mindfully in something that has a certain inexhaustibility. The more you know about it, the more you know you do not know. But that is not just simply a sign of one's limitation, it's a sign also of a certain too muchness, so to say, in the truth that is being sought. Another theme, beauty. Beauty is very central in this particular work also. And here I think the influence of Balthasar on David's work is, I think, evident. And beauty, interestingly enough, is a very Platonic theme. We tend to think of Plato as the enemy of the image, the enemy of the body, and yet the place of beauty as that striking manifestation of a certain fullness in which the noetic and the aesthetic come together is very, very important. So beauty is a present and striking inexhaustibility. Something about the beautiful is more than we could ever determine, and yet it draws us to it and draws us on into a sense of something exceeding, or determination and or self-determination. Again, I'm just underlining a number of themes that struck me, but the Platonic influence is very strong. And a question that we could pursue perhaps a bit in a discussion is that perennial... Sorry. Hey, I'm suddenly big. When I mentioned Aristotle, the room changed. That perennial relation between Aristotle and Plato, the difference between them, the question of whether certain philosophical souls are more Platonic rather than Aristotelian, or whether in fact the whole tension or contrast between the two is somewhat overstated. But I think it's actually a question also for the character of some of the discussions in this particular book. Some of them are more Aristotelian, some of them are more Platonic. But my own sense is that I know it's the tradition of Aristotle being honored as the master of those who know is so strong within the Catholic tradition that and Plato is that bad dualist who didn't understand that forms are immanent in the things themselves and so on. But there is a side that is very Platonic in David's work, and it's not incidental, of course, that he wrote a fine book on Plato called Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. So perhaps you and the listeners can ask him what he means by impure. The Catholicity of reason, and Plato's reason is impure, but can one be impure and be Catholic? Impure in a good sense. Okay, my apologies for speaking in Heraclitean riddles. One of, again, I think a very interesting discussion in the book is about the nature of cause, and David gives a very rich interpretation of the change of the notion of cause that happens in modernity. It's a very interesting discussion of Plato's view of the world as an iconic cosmos, an iconic totality, in which the ultimate sense of cause is the good. And when we look at someone like Galileo in the two dialogues, the stress there, and he quotes from Galileo about the rape of the senses, the sense of reason that comes to the fore in modern science leads to the rape of the senses, in the sense that reason is not something that simply pays attention. It is this sort of mindful attentiveness to what shows itself in sensuous fullness, but rather already has a certain, if you like, project of reason, which in a sense imposes itself on the senses. And and to me actually offers a very persuasive account of rehabilitating a richer sense of cause than the modern reduction to a certain version of efficient cause as mechanical, operating in a kind of more neutralized there-ness called the material world. And again, as I say, it's the Platonic sources of inspiration that strike me in David's account. Another very important theme is the relation between love and knowing. He wants to recuperate a non-exclusive relation of the two. So a conception of knowing that is not necessarily possessive of the object. I see him here as in some ways recovering the Aristotelian sense of the identity of knower and known, but also the sense of an otherness in a manner that avoids the Hegelian appropriation of the otherness. David has also written very well on German philosophy, and Hegel most especially. And while he is not hostile to Hegel, he is not also under his spell, especially with respect to the otherness of the divine, the dissimilitude that is always greater than the similitude. There's also a very, in my view, nuanced discussion of Heidegger and ontotheology on the notion of wonder itself as the originating occasion of philosophy. And in David's interpretation, ultimately Heidegger's view yields to a more univocal view of the history of being. and questions of an important character are to be raised about Heidegger's understanding. So, some thoughts. I've already indicated the sense of the interplay between the Platonic and the Aristotelian. And that could be put also in terms of the interplay between the Augustinian and the Thomist. I mean, he did teach at Villanova for many years, and as an Augustinian university, the abiding inspiration of Augustinian sources is very, very strong there. Why I mention this is that in my amateur understanding of the Augustinian orientation, there's a certain tolerance of thresholds of fluidity. This is how I'm putting it, that a tolerance of permeabilities between the philosophical and the theological. Augustine doesn't come across as a professor of either philosophy or theology who is guarding a territory. The professor of philosophy wanting to guard his territory of natural reason, or the professor of theology wanting to guard his prized space of revelation. But rather, his way of thinking seems to move fluidly and effortlessly between one and the other. He's more plurivocal in a Platonic sense, whereas one wonders at times whether, even though Aristotle will want to talk about being as analogical, there is a certain drift towards a kind of univocal determinability as somehow giving us a more secure hold on the intelligible as such. Now again, I'm putting these as questions for elaboration in the case of David. I'm not formulating a criticism. I'm, in a sense, just asking that the question perhaps be addressed a little bit more, because the relation between philosophy and theology is really very central, keeps recurring throughout the book as a whole. There are times when I'm reminded of the Rubik's Cube. You remember, I mean, there are enough older people here to remember when the world was swept by a craze for solving the Rubik's Cube in the quickest time possible. I tried it myself, but sometimes debates between, the respective domains of philosophy and theology, and the Rubik's Cube experts suddenly get into motion. Who gets it out as quickly as possible? Now, I think that often follows from an excessively rigid disciplinary sense of what philosophy and theology is. And again, I'm not objecting to that disciplinary definition, but in fact, all of the disciplines ultimately have some source in this more originating wonder. And one of the dangers with disciplinary thinking is precisely determinate thresholds define what we are and what we are in relation to the other. And this more original wonder that actually is the source of the determinate falls out of the picture, and we set up our spaces of exclusion rather than thresholds of permeability between the one and the other. Now, I take, there are a few pages in David where I feel as if he is trying to solve the Rubik's Cube. In the last part, one particular chapter is, I was wondering myself if I could actually even figure out some of the movements that he was making. They were very intricate, and perhaps he can elaborate them a little bit more. But I think the deeper spirit of his work, in fact, is, again, that sense of thresholds that invite movement back and forth between the philosophical and the theological. Again, that can be very alarming if one thinks of disciplinary spaces if one wants to have a more univocal sense of this is where we stand as philosophers, this is where we stand as theologians. But again, the invocation of someone like Augustine, it seems to me, is very relevant here. Augustine was a religious lover and a bishop. Aquinas was a university professor and a friar. Am I criticizing Aquinas? No, but I do think something of that Augustinian porosity, if you like, between the philosophical and the theological is something to be recommended. I'm watching the time. I have just a few other, there are many other things that I could say. Again, this is a question, there is a discussion that follows on from his discussion of Heidegger where he brings in the pseudo-Dionysius and an extended account of the erotics of the divine, the notion of God as erotic love. And I just want to ask the question about the use of the erotics of the divine. I mean, the exposition of Dionysus is exemplary, but in the gospel, the word is agape, and again, it's used, to my knowledge, 320 times, not eros. And I'm asking this question because eros, in some ways, is easier to handle on immanent terms than the notion of the agapeic. Jean-Luc Marion wrote a book some years ago called The Erotic Phenomenon. Early on in his career, he actually pointed a kind of desideratum to thinking philosophically about the agapeic. In my view, he never actually fulfilled that desideratum. But perhaps it's true to French culture. Once he had written on the erotic, suddenly he wasn't just simply a kind of an odd Catholic phenomenologist. He was taken into the heart of the nation itself. That's not a philosophical criticism of Marion, by the way, but it's a symptomology of how easier it is actually to talk about erotics than agapeics. But there's something strange about the agapeic, and there's something strange about the Christian tradition that would, I'm not again retreating to something like a Nigerian position where erotics and agapeics are to be seen as dualistic opposites to each other. But I think it's a really fundamental question for philosophy itself, whether one can think the agapeic throughout the philosophical tradition. When love has been to the fore, it's often either philia or eros. But it would be a very interesting question to ask if the agapeic can be brought into the space of philosophical reflection and not just simply then be a desertion of philosophy. And I think that's a kind of a question which it strikes me as very much apropos of the project of David. One final point about the universal, the katholon, the katholou, according to the whole, the language of the whole. A question that I have about the whole is that when we think of a whole, we often think of something that is enclosed within itself, the circular motion in which the beginning returns to the end. And I think there's a danger, philosophy as the attempt to give an account of the whole, that you can have a holism that itself is not properly seen as a threshold that opens up to a sense of divine transcendence. So the sense of the universal that is not actually a closed whole, it seems to me, is a very, very important issue. I've been working on the idea of an intimate universal, and I mention it here not to just advertise my own secret wares, but in some ways the sense of the Catholicity of Reason that I find in David's work is close to what I would call the intimate universal. Intimate in the sense that it must do justice to what is most deeply interior in beings, and most especially in the human being, but it has to also do justice to what is most extensive relative to the community of being as a whole. You can have a sense of the whole which doesn't do justice to the intimacy. You can have a sense of the intimacy which doesn't do justice to that more universal openness or communicability. I think actually within the monotheistic tradition, you have this extraordinary resource to think together the intimate, singular, and the sense of the universal as a community that includes all. But it's at a threshold like this that the small c, so to say, of Catholicity becomes permeable to the big C of Catholicity. So on that tautology, I'll fold my tent and return to my humble place at the table. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I also would like to thank Dr. Schindler for the invitation and the possibility to speak on this very intriguing book. And I find that it is not often in the Anglo-Saxon world that philosophers dare to connect so many different forms of thought across the ages. And yet it is something I'm rather familiar with from my own German training, especially under Robert Spemann. And many of the insights, I think, in that book, I'm thinking, for example, on the comparison between Heidegger and Hegel or Galileo and thoughts on postmodernism, I don't think would have emerged without that wide vision. And I acknowledge that certainly that specialization and compartmentalization in philosophy can be of value if one wants to hone in on finer points, but only if one does not simultaneously lose sight of the whole. Only the reflection on the whole prevents us from setting up the questions in the wrong way and getting lost in the often unnecessary labyrinths which one often finds in analytical philosophy. And so that itself, I think, is a form of Catholicity of reason that helps us not to lose sight of the whole. There are other denials of Catholicity that have already been mentioned, contemporary forms of skepticism, postmodern or other, or the limitations of reason to the observable that we might find in Kant, and that many of these might be false forms of humility indeed, perhaps in other ways rooted in pride or setting up false totalities. A more complicated form of the limitation of reason emerges from the Catholicity of reason itself in the sense of Catholicity in its denominational or theological sense. For it is part of the Catholic doctrine itself to distinguish between faith and reason. Both have distinct methodological principles and starting points. Reason relies on its very own necessary and self-evident first principles, while faith begins from the empirical and contingent data of revelation. And contrary to rationalist forms of thought, reason cannot of itself produce the content of revelation, and at the same time, reason can also not exclude revelation from its consideration simply because revelation is. It is real and therefore falls into the horizon of being. Faith, on the other hand, short of fideism, has to rely on the independent principles of reason in order to come to an understanding of its own content. On its own, faith also cannot defend itself against the charge of superstition, or distinguish between literal and metaphorical uses of language. Both these issues require a recourse to the independent criteria of intelligibility that philosophical reason provides. And in this way, both faith and reason need each other and include each other. And any Catholic philosopher certainly will appreciate the claim that reason is Catholic in the sense that it claims that the claims which faith makes on our minds cannot be totally extrinsic to it. Making the contents of faith philosophically intelligible is not a false kind of Hellenization of Christianity. Rather, it is the only way to embrace the incarnate Logos and truly make him our own. Now, what these principles are, which Catholic philosophers are to employ, and what this employment entails about the very notion of reason, this seems to be less clear. From what I can see, there are currently two main forms of Catholic thought that do not easily mesh. And I don't mean Plato and Aristotle, although we can ask whether that's related somehow, nor between Augustine and Aquinas. Let me spell these positions out, and I apologize if it sounds a little bit like a caricature, but sort of in the brevity of it, perhaps it helps. So there is, on the one hand, a form of personalism that has roots in Husserl's, Scheler's, and von Hildebrandt's phenomenology. It's a form of thought that mixes more readily with Hans Urs von Balthasar's theology, and perhaps also with more charismatic styles of liturgical expression. And here, the ultimate court of appeal is frequently the experience of human persons and its structure of disclosure. What, or rather who, this human person is, as the subject of these experiences, this will often be considered inaccessible to intellectual and metaphysical explorations. As it is sometimes said, only an act of love can access what a person is, and at the same time avoid undue objectifications and reifications of this personal reality. Personal reality becomes the ultimate form of reality that there is, and indeed its very paradigm. Now, the other form of thought can be associated with the metaphysical tradition of Aristotle. It mixes more readily with the thought and theology of Thomas Aquinas, and is often connected with liturgical leanings that are more traditionalist in nature. And here the ultimate court of appeal would not be human consciousness and personal experience, but being as such, which is the fundamental ontological principle of act and potency, essence and existence, as well as the first principles of logic. Here then, not phenomenology is the first science, as Husserl suggested, but metaphysics. It is metaphysics that makes human consciousness and personhood intelligible, not the other way around. Experience has to justify itself before reality thus conceived, even if this will lead to the charge of a certain kind of objectivism. In terms of affinities, metaphysical thought, on the one hand, will currently more readily connect with forms of Anglo-Saxon analytical thought. That might be one of the reasons why Thomism is well and alive primarily in the United States. And the personalist form of thought may have a great affinity to postmodern and continental ways of thinking. So as I said, this might be a bit of a caricature, but I do think there is some truth to it, and I hope that it might help to spell out the questions at hand. And I also make the distinction so as to explain why we should appreciate Dr. Schindler's book. The Catholicity of Reason that he proposes is Catholic also in the sense that it aims at transcending these factions. I very much appreciate the ease with which he moves between the various traditions and makes fertile connections between these two approaches. This is again a form of thought I'm familiar with from Robert Spemann, who lives in both traditions as well. And I also find myself in large agreement with most of the things that are proposed in his book, though I will nuance some of the insights in ways I will suggest in a moment. So in spite of valiant attempts to bridge the gap, there remain some tensions, and they're worth exploring. After all, both these forms I characterized rather unambiguously want to be Catholic in an increasingly hostile secular environment. And yet there seems to be this fundamental, rather fundamental divide in approach. And it is a difference that goes perhaps even deeper than the traditional differences of philosophies that are used in the Catholic world, such as Scotism, Thomism, Augustinianism, Suarezionism. All of these latter forms would probably be more metaphysical in outlook, in contrast with the more modern personalist forms of thought, which might, on the other hand, have some affinities to Augustinian notions. St. John Paul II, to whom this institute is dedicated, was trained in both forms of thought, and he used both of them in his writings on personhood. He seems to have been aware of the tension that this produced, and he tried to articulate the difference by characterizing them as an objective and a subjective view of personhood, respectively. Now, such juxtapositions try to do justice to both sides, and yet they will not typically be appreciated by philosophical minds. Philosophers tend to have a different habitus mentis than theologians do. Theologians are more comfortable with a sapiential approach that groups things in a both-and fashion and balances everything in a Catholic overall view of things. Philosophers tend to be less relaxed about such polarities. After all, in order to understand polarities, they have to be thought sub specie uni. To think a difference means to transcend the difference in some form and make it intelligible from a unified perspective. Hence, to characterize the distinction between personalism and metaphysics as one between subjective and objective views, respectively, will not quite satisfy either side. For both views claim to be a grasp of the whole. Personalists do not want to consider themselves subjectivists, or just one half of the picture. And while Thomists should welcome the challenge to develop a Thomist theory of consciousness and subjectivity, they would consider the viewpoint of being and its principles as something that itself precedes and transcends the modern distinction of subject and object. As you might expect from a Dominican, my first inclination is to read the insights of personalism through the thought of Thomas Aquinas, rather than vice versa. Nevertheless, the Catholicity of the Philosophia per Ennis will also not allow me to ignore insights that can be found elsewhere. Here then is how I would articulate the difference as briefly as time permits. To my mind, the history of philosophy is not a history of footnotes to Plato, but to Parmenides. The puzzle of being and how it can possibly be more than one, this has to have gripped us at least once before we can begin to think philosophically. The most fundamental thought is that of being. Being is the most encompassing notion we can discover. For being does not leave anything outside of itself, because everything that is not is nothing. This also means that literally only nothing can be added to being. The question then will arise whether anything can make a difference in being. Differentiating being seems to imply an addition of differentiating features, such as that one part is not another part, be it spatially, temporally, or in any other ontological way. But what is it that can distinguish such parts? Again, nothing can be added to being, and being itself does not make that difference. That one part is not another part is a mere negation. And negations are not something, but nothing. Negations cannot make a difference. How then can being be other than one and simple? Philosophies will vary in the ways they try to answer this question. Hegel's proposal at the beginning of his Logic, for example, is different from Plato's chorismos or Heidegger's ontological difference. And all of them are different from Aristotle's act-potency distinction. One recurring proposal would seem to be the distinction of appearance and reality. Thus, one might propose that the experience of a manifold is mere appearance, while reality is in fact one and simple. The implication of this proposal is that the most fundamental distinction within being itself is not that between things, but the distinction between that which appears and that which is being appeared to. Only on the basis of this distinction will other distinctions be made intelligible. This form of thought can be found among the ancient Greek sophists, and it still colors Plato's distinction between the realm of fleeting sensual appearances and the reality of intelligible, unchanging ideas. It is also the basic form of much of modern thought, where it distinguishes primarily between subject and object, in the fashion of Kant and German idealism, or also in American pragmatism and in yet other ways in phenomenology and the many forms of thought dependent on it. While all of these are obviously very different among each other, they all rely on some form of subject-object distinction as most fundamental. In spite of himself, this would be true even for Heidegger, since the ontological difference is in some manner the disclosure or clearing of appearing and being appeared to. The wonder of being and various forms of causality will then be explained on this paradigm. Aristotle in the Thomist metaphysical tradition, on the other hand, will take the fundamental distinction within being to be that of act and potency. What Parmenides says about the one and simple being is in some sense true, namely of God. But there are other forms of being that participate in the fullness of God's being. They participate, that is, they take part in being by way of a particular nature that limits their act of being to the particular kind of being they are. Now, as limited, they have their being only potentially, not of themselves, but by participation. Hence, the most fundamental distinction is that of the act of being and the limiting essence or nature of a thing that has this act of being. There are further distinctions of act and potency within these limited beings, but they all depend on this most fundamental ontological difference between esse and essentia. One such further distinction is that between first and second act. The first act would be the very act of being that constitutes the existence of the thing. It is the very act that actualizes its essence. But once we exist, we can do further things: thinking, willing, eating ice cream, or playing the piano. If we cease to do these things, we do not cease to exist. We only lose our secondary acts, not our primary act of existence. If we slip into a coma, we do not thereby cease to exist as human persons. Nor does an existence in utero disqualify us from a personal existence. To my mind, this is a very important and largely forgotten distinction, which with many crucial applications. The application in the case at hand is first of all this: the acts of consciousness according to which something is being appeared to are secondary acts, not primary acts. The subject that personalism analyzes is a subject that has experiences, and many instructive insights emerge from the analysis of such acts. But all of these acts are secondary acts. The person that has these acts exists prior to these acts. And this is both in the logical sense of prior, but also, if you think of the development of embryos, a temporal sense of priority. Moreover, if we want to give an account of being and reality at large, we need concepts that are wider than an analysis of consciousness can provide. For example, there might be galaxies that will never be visible to any consciousness except to God's. They might never appear in any of Heidegger's clearings, yet they clearly are. And they are instances of an ontological difference of a very different sort. They have their own kind of being according to act and potency, even apart from any distinction of appearance and reality. Appearance is just one kind of reality. It does not mark the most fundamental distinction. And so also what is articulated in the analogy of being does not primarily track the excessus of God or being over against our mind, but the different ways in which things are. Analogy is not primarily an epistemological notion, theological or otherwise, but a metaphysical notion of the analogous ways of being according to act and potency. Epistemological notions, subject-object relationships, or disclosure experiences are only particular subsets of the more fundamental act-potency relationships. If this is true, then there are further implications. One implication concerns the order of transcendentals. The transcendentals are the most fundamental notions that are convertible with being according to their extension or reference. Yet they are logically different according to the different sense or intention, that is, intention with an S. According to Aquinas, there is a sequence in which these transcendentals emerge, namely that of ens, res, unum, aliquid, verum, bonum, and pulchrum. The latter three, the true, the good, and the beautiful, are a certain point of contention between those who follow Thomas Aquinas and Hans Urs von Balthasar respectively. And I very much appreciate David Schindler's attempt to reconcile these 2 points of view in his 3rd chapter, which I knew already beforehand as an article from the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly and have given to my students in the past. Now, what should we say about the sequence of transcendentals and these different approaches? The first thing to notice, however, is that these are only three of the transcendentals. And in Aquinas' sequence, they come at the tail end only. Focusing on these three might in some way be forgetful of being in the first act, if I may say so. The good, the true, and the beautiful are the personalist transcendentals insofar as they imply a relation to our cognitive or appetitive faculties, focusing on and being dependent on our own secondary acts. The disclosure experience of beauty, for example, entails the actualization of the secondary acts in which and to which we awake when we first encounter an other, such as the smile of a mother, to take Balthasar's example. And yet we did exist before that, from conception on, as the unique persons that we are. The first act precedes the second act, and our most fundamental and constitutive relation to another is not experiential. It is the relation of being created by the first cause of all things. Even within the secondary cognitive and appetitive acts, we need to be conscious of something, aliquid, an earlier transcendental, and of something that is, ens, being. And just as much as we exist before we awaken to consciousness, so also that which we are conscious of exists before we are conscious of it. Being precedes the appearance-reality distinction, and with that, the distinction of truth and goodness. On both the subject and the object side, there is something older than the relation as subject and object. And it is not Schelling's elusive ground of being, accessible to intellectual intuition, but rather the very concrete entities themselves. In this sense, then, being, res, unum, and aliquid come first in the order of being and logic. This does not mean that quod nos, for us, in the order of discovery and knowledge, we should not begin from the other end, that is, from beauty. To use another image, we might think of beauty as the capstone transcendental, the one that presupposes, summarizes, unites, and comprehends all the other ones, combining the true and good in a peculiar fashion, and with that all the other transcendentals that these two presuppose. Being, in turn, would be something like the foundation stone transcendental, the one presupposed by all the others that build on it. If we take it in this way, it becomes a question not of what is more important, but rather an attempt at understanding their structural relation. We should also hasten to add that calling being a foundation stone transcendental does not mean that the relations established by the later transcendentals, though they build on being, thereby transcend being. Nothing, after all, can exceed being, or else it would be nothing indeed. The transcendence implied here is intrinsic to being. Being is not just a part of the structure, but the whole in its unfolding. Indeed, the circulatio of the three final transcendentals articulate the being as translucid to itself. But they are therefore then being and beauty on both ends of the spectrum. One is the foundation stone as one, and the other is the capstone, as I would say, are structurally related. And again, it's not a matter of importance, but the order of logic and being on the one hand, and the order of knowledge and approach on the other hand. Being would then allow us the most comprehensive view of this foundation of being. Being becomes visible through beauty in its depth dimension. And indeed, if we can correlate essence and existence with truth and goodness respectively, then the free, surprising, contingent, and wondrous existence of things would be disclosed in beauty, together with their essence, form, and gestalt. This disclosure might very well come at the very beginning of our conscious experience, and uno actu, perhaps in the smile of the mother indeed. And this certainly should make sense to a Thomist as well. Similarly, we might consider God himself. If God is personal, then a Thomist insists that we need to understand this personal reality through the pure act of being that God is. Rather than with the more personal attributes of will and intellect, we have to begin with his very being, lest we end up with anthropomorphic misunderstandings of God as something like us, only larger, bigger, and better. This does not exclude, but rather requires us to make certain conceptual distinctions within God based on our own self-understanding as persons. Though everything is one in God's simplicity, the conceptual distinctions and features of intelligibility that these distinctions trace are not exchangeable, as if they were mere tautologies or synonyms. Thus, we cannot say that God is wise by his goodness or loving by his knowledge. He does not pardon the sinner by his justice, nor does he punish anyone by his mercy. These distinctions remain important. Even the logical order of these distinctions is important. For even the aforementioned distinction between first and second act is applicable. Even given divine simplicity, there is a virtual distinction between the love with which he loves himself and the love with which he loves creation. Here's where the erotic question comes in. It is only in this way that God's generosity is preserved, for he loves himself necessarily, but his creatures freely. And here is where I would think Plato's image of the sun would seem less helpful. Maybe that's a question to talk about. A certain logical order will also obtain between the transcendentals in God. Even God cannot love himself without knowing himself, nor can he be beautiful to himself without both. The need for proper distinctions and logical sequences is perhaps what makes me a little uneasy about the use of the Trinitarian notion of circumincession. Perhaps it seems a bit like a poetic blurring of these distinctions, but perhaps also that does not need to be the case. The very circular structure the structures that are suggested here might be able to preserve the distinctions, for one cannot really have a circle if there are no distinctions between the points on the circumference. Or if you take elliptic images, one will want to preserve the polarities. And a final word on ourselves. For being is indeed disclosed to us in an ultimate way when we see the pure act of God in the beatific vision. This vision is an act-potency relationship as well, for we will be fully actualized, fully alive for the glory of God. And I have no doubts that what makes this vision beatific has to do with the experience of beauty. Beauty is beatific. And since beauty combines the good and the true, it will also combine the acts of our intellect and our will. Now, how exactly the will and the intellect are involved here, and whether there's a priority of one over the other, is notoriously difficult and labyrinthine kind of question in Thomas Aquinas, and there's no need for me here to repeat your careful analysis in your 4th chapter. I would think, however, that Aquinas, obscure passages notwithstanding, would maintain that one cannot love what one does not know. Even on earth, loving God, though it is better than knowing God in this world, presupposes at least a general notion of God. In heaven, our notion of God is, in fact, God himself, God's essence informing our intellect in an unmediated way. Yet even then, we can never comprehend the infinite God fully with our finite minds. Even if elevated by the lumen gloriae, these minds remain finite. Nor can any act of the will remedy this situation, or so I would maintain. For our love will remain measured by the extent to which we know God. And this will always result in a finite knowledge and love of the infinite God. And yet, we truly know God. We do not know God infinitely, but we do know that God is infinite. In this, our mind transcends itself towards that which it knows. Reason is Catholic in that it transcends itself towards being itself. In this manner, reason also opens out into faith in this life and unto the beatific vision in the life to come. And I found myself in wide agreement with the notion of reason that is self-transcendent, a theme that permeates much of the book. I'm just not exactly sure why this would not result from the nature of reason itself, which seems to be suggested in the book, rather than being due to an involvement of the will. The anima quodam modo omnia, open to being as such, transcends itself insofar as it itself is just one particular way of being and knows itself as such. As long and precisely if we maintain a non-reductionist notion of reason, we might then have sufficient ways to explain why our mind, in its second act, can participate in the knowledge of a God who will necessarily transcend it. This participation by the second act would then mirror that of the first act, for it is in analogous ways that we can participate in God's being in our first act of existence without thereby exhausting the very meaning of being. And yes, the will moves towards the external object, including God. But if God were not already reached in some way by reason, how would this be possible? How would the will be reaching out to God? And how could the will move reason beyond itself? The will moves to the real thing itself, but only as known. And how can the will in turn itself be self-transcendent unless it is by virtue of the intellect proposing a universal object to its desire? It is the intellect that helps the will towards self-transcendence, not the other way around. And if indeed non-reductionist reason is intrinsically self-transcendent, why would something's being in the intellect be a problem? Being in our minds, then, just means that we have come into contact with something, rather than remaining untouched by it. Being in the mind is then not a form of possessiveness, but rather of letting oneself be interiorly touched by what one knows, by another. And perhaps thus being touched is the sense of wonder that would be compatible with the attainment of knowledge. Again, if reason is intrinsically self-transcendent, why does it need the appetitive movement towards the object as a completion of its own operations? Should we not rather say that this appetitive motion is the completion of the telos of the whole person, rather than of the intellect? And would this not be more desirable for personalist thought as well? Beauty as a complement of the fulfillment of the whole person, combining both the cognitive and the appetitive dimension. And again, I do not see why a Thomist would not be happy to agree with such a notion. Understood in this way, Catholic wholeness would then concern the act of the whole soul, the whole person, though not qua first act. Rather, it would be an orchestrated concert of all the second acts, playing tutti, if you want, like an orchestra. This would include all the faculties emanating, yet distinct from the ground and essence of the soul. Though not identical with this essence of the soul, the union of all the faculties in the perception of beauty, as the capstone transcendental, does correspond to and articulates the union of the first act of the soul itself, which is the foundation stone. And this experience of beauty would be truly Catholic indeed. Thank you.
It's okay. Yes, it is on. I want to thank both the speakers for very rich comments, and to respond thoroughly to each of them would take far too much time, and I'd like to leave room for questions, and also a number of things said I would need to reflect on further. But I think I'll just make two comments in relation to each, and then we can open up. But I'm grateful for the depth of the reading of the book and the seriousness of the questions. With regard to William's comments, I want to talk about just this question that he raised about eros in God and an agapeics in philosophy, and then secondly, to talk about the sense of a universal that is not a closed whole that he referred to. So I'll begin with those. The question of Dionysius and his privileging of the notion of eros in God as a way of talking about the love of God, and he acknowledges he himself acknowledges it's not a common notion in Scripture, but he finds that it's appropriate, and that's something that is echoed throughout the tradition. In Origen, even in Aquinas, does not criticize him for doing that, which doesn't yet explain that in itself is not simply a justification. But what I would suggest is, first of all, acknowledge. I do think that there's something very much to be gained in thinking of a distinction between eros and agape that's different from our typical thinking of it. We tend to think of it in terms of a difference between a more self-centered notion of love and a more other-centered notion of love. That eros is more self-centered, agape is more other-centered. But that way of thinking is simply doesn't do justice to the tradition, and I think that there's quite a bit that one could say in criticism of it. It seems to me a more fruitful way of thinking is that. I mean, they both include a kind of, they're not so much different, as Augustine sort of observed, they're not so much different in terms of their form. Even eros is initiated by the other, so there's a priority of otherness, I think, in a certain sense, in both of them. A more fruitful way of thinking of the distinction is to think of one as love in its more natural form, eros as love in its more natural form, and agape as love as originating specifically from God, and that changes our way of thinking about it. Now, if that's fruitful, why privilege the notion of eros in this book? A couple of things. One is it seems to me that there's and again, I don't want to rule out the idea of an agapeics in philosophy. Actually, I find that, and I know that that's something that you've written on extensively. I find it a very interesting, fascinating, and fruitful notion. But to justify the focus here, I think there are two possible dangers. One would be if we insist on the distinction too strongly, we lose a sense of we end up that sort of unprethinkability that we attribute to agape. In a way, we there's a tendency then to lose that as part of the experience of eros. So the danger would be a possible impoverishment of what we mean by eros, and we then might relegate eros to the thinkable or something like that, which I think wouldn't do justice to the experience. But also, I think that the danger would be then that we would, without seeing a genuine analogy between human love and divine love, we would end up possibly rendering divine love, in a certain sense, irrational, at least approaching that. So that would be one problem. The other problem too is perhaps a subtle one, but it seems to me that if we do think of agape as love that has its origin in God specifically, that there's a certain sense in which it's a specifically theological form of love. And so a danger in a philosophical agapeics might be, in a certain sense, the kind of Hegelian usurpation of the theological into the realm of philosophy, as opposed to recognizing a kind of a privileged standpoint from the standpoint of faith. So, I think that there's a lot to be discussed about that, but that's just a basic response. As far as the notion of a universal that is not a closed whole, I just want to make the notion of an intimate universal. I found just extraordinary, very fruitful. It's a beautiful insight, and I think a fruitful one. In William's description of it, he mentioned the importance of conceiving a universal that's not a closed whole. Virtually, I think everything that he said, I absolutely would agree with, but I would want to maybe qualify that one statement, because it seems to me we have a certain tendency to think of a closed whole as cut off from what lies beyond it, and so in order to preserve a sort of openness, we have to fragment, or we have to resist completion and perfection. And it seems to me that in fact, from a really profound notion of the analogy of being, we ought first to say that one is most perfectly open to what transcends when one is most complete. C.S. Lewis says somewhere that he found that his longing was most intense precisely when he was happiest. His longing for what lies beyond is precisely when he was happiest. And I think that coincidence of closure and transcendence is really crucial, that we don't associate openness with incompletion, or else we run into all sorts of difficulties. And I'm not implying that's. I know that you've made that kind of criticism yourself before, so I don't see that as contrary to your suggestion. As far as the very thoughtful argument that Father Anselm presented, it's something that I'd like to reflect on some more, and first of all reread and contemplate. But there are two points that I want to make. One concerns the ordering of the transcendentals, and then the second about the beatific vision, the priority of reason and the will. So much of what you said, Father, I would very much agree with, and I find helpful the caution about not neglecting, for example, the first transcendentals and focusing only. That's a point very well taken. My only comment in response to that, and perhaps I think I gathered from the ending of your comments that this isn't so much a disagreement. I think maybe I'm repeating a point that you were making, but that is that though being is the foundation stone of the transcendentals, there's absolutely that's true, but I think we would also want to say that as in this unfolding and even into then the transcendentals that correspond into second act, into the operations of intellect and will, we don't want to say that you've got an original meaning and then additional meanings in these as these further transcendentals unfold, but there's something sort of retroactive about the revelation, so that in a way being comes first, but it's each one is a revelation of being, and in a certain sense you don't start until you've gotten all the way to the end. I mean, so that there really is a kind of reciprocal illumination in the transcendentals. So, but the point is very well taken, that the importance of recognizing the absolute priority of being before any encounter, even as that priority, the being that is prior, is clarified and disclosed in the personal encounter. So That's the first comment. And then the second one regarding the priority of intellect and will. I want to clarify. I tried to make clear that the relationship that I was reflecting on in the book about the relative priority of reason and love is different from the question of the priority of intellect and will. In fact, I wanted to try to think of love not simply as an act of the will and not simply within the appetitive order, but rather first in relation to beauty. And what you have there is that you don't have then a loving that's not also in some sense a knowing, and a knowing that is not already in some sense of loving in beauty, but that becomes a kind of a original point from which then you can further deepen that relationship through deepening of one's knowledge and a deepening of one's appetitive willing of the other. I mean, I find it interesting, you said that the beatific vision, to think of beatific vision in terms of beauty, which Aquinas doesn't do. I mean, beauty, you gave beauty a much more privileged position than Aquinas typically does. But I think that's, in a certain sense, that's precisely the point. If you think of beatific vision in terms of beauty, then there's room for the general Thomistic understanding of the priority of the intellect over the will and any discrete acts of will. Yeah. So there's some other comments about this question about whether reason can transcend itself, but I maybe that's something we can talk about at dinner. But open up maybe now for questions, if anybody has any questions, either for me or either of the speakers.
Thank you for the comments. That was very impressive. In your comments, Professor Desmond, you had focused on the anticipatory foreknowledge that presupposes any seeking after truth, which Plato emphasizes. And then in your talk, you had mentioned about that we first must know before we can love. But in a sense, when we know, there's a distinction between explicit knowledge of articulation of that which is known and implicit, in a sense, unarticulated awareness that perhaps love could have a type of anticipatory access to. So that is just a comment, if someone could talk about that.
Sure. I think you mentioned in your book a passage by Aquinas that one can love a science without knowing it yet. You know, I think that's the kind of anticipatory knowledge that you might have. And if we think of studying a science, well, we study the science because we take an interest in it. There's an element of love and attention in that, but we wouldn't have to study it if we knew it already. You know, and Aquinas does compare that in a way in which we approach God. So in this life, we don't have an explicit knowledge of God, and in the life to come, there's no comprehensive knowledge either, but there's an anticipatory knowledge. And I think without that, one also cannot love God in this life. And I mean, that's sort of the intricate kind of question, you know, what is more important, to love God or to know God? And it's both and. I mean, it's not... So it depends what you're looking at. So if knowledge moves something into us, Aquinas says, then it will bring the object known to our level. And so in the case of a stone, it's much better to lift the stone to our level, of course. You know, if it's about God, we would bring down God to our level. Therefore, he says, it's better to love God. If we would love a stone, that would bring us down to the level of the stone. If we love God, it brings us up to the level of God. That's perhaps the erotic dimension, you know. So in that sense, there is the importance of love. And yet, the question I would like to ask Aquinas is, if we love God in that way, doesn't that also imply a certain anticipatory knowledge of God? Because otherwise, how can we do that? And I think the only way that works is indeed it's an anticipatory knowledge, and that much needs to be there. So.
If I could just build on that, precisely this anticipatory knowledge, one of the aims of the book is to articulate that in terms of the mind's already, the ecstatic character of reason, so that sense that the reach exceeds the grasp again, that reason is out already beyond itself, and that's why there can be a kind of a love that's not a reduction of the thing, that's a love that's not depending on a knowledge that's reducing the thing down to me, because in a way that's setting the horizon of the love already in a too reduced way. So this notion of reason, we tend to think of reason as sitting in our control center here and kind of radiating out into the world, but I think that's I think that's an inheritance from the modern philosophy and the various anthropologies that grew out of that. I think a much richer sense is to think of our interior life is not just going on inside our heads, but I mean that our soul exceeds our body, and we're participating. We're in the truth. We're participating in the world beyond what we grasp. Our reach exceeds our grasp, and that I think is able to pick up some of the Meno problem and this issue of the relationship between love and knowledge. I think in a helpful way. I hope.
I just to add to these, I think you can draw attention to things in certainly human experience where you strangely are in love, but you don't know it. I mean, we know this from romantic comedies and so on. We watching the movie know that these two antagonistic people really love each other, especially when they shout at each other and so on. But what happens during the movie is that it dawns on them that they actually love each other. Now, I'm interested in the phenomenon of dawning, the happening of a dawning. It's a kind of an awakening, and its relation to what is before and what is after. Afterwards, you could say they now know that they love each other, but dawning, as one of these threshold experiences, somehow participates in the knowing and the not knowing at the same time. And I think that this is very relevant actually to the knowledge of God as itself a kind of dawning. I think you could actually do a hermeneutics of Augustine's Confessions as a progressive dawning on him that he loved what at another level he did not know and now awakens to.
In the same area, I would, after some of the things Father said, what I would want to say is, I know the will was the effective part, but if we want the connatural fittingness of the being for that end, right, isn't that the part of the expectation, which I think is actually behind your notion that reason is already pushing, trying to transcend. So I would say, and this goes back to something Father said was really important, that you wanted to go to being as first, and God is that himself, but we are first, and then there's secondary acts. In that primary act, there is the connatural directiveness, which we have a kind of expectation that's in there. And this is thinking out what another thing that you had said. We're participating. We're participants of being. We're participating for that end. And that end is already present there in an effective way, which is not the will, but in a connatural way, which is more in the power of the will, which I think is the way I think Thomas understands this, because all love is related to a kind of fittingness between us and the beloved. And there is a kind of notion that when we take the will as being principally in its act, we're not paying enough attention to the prior fittingness, which I think goes to the notion that David is talking about reason. And I think the transcendent is part of the effective aspect of our connatural being. In other words, since we are creatures, in the Exitus, there is already prefigured the Reditus, with now grace having to come in and all that other part. But that seems to be the correct, what I would think would be the Thomistic way of answering some of your problems with that. And I worry too much about the modern notion of the affectivity of the will without the prior natural affectivity, which is kind of a worry I have. Okay. That's just a comment. If I don't know
I would it is interesting that's part of my resistance of reducing love to the order of the appetite, to the good, because it's interesting. Aquinas defines love first as a complacency, complacencia, but it's a pleasing, but it's precisely the tuning of the appetite to the object of love that precedes the appetite. So there is that kind of fittingness that would correspond to the co-naturality. I think that this dimension emerges when you recognize the priority of beauty as, in a way, opening up the horizon for the reason and the will. That's a large part of the argument there.
I think that's what I meant with the so if we take love to correspond to beauty rather than the good in this sense, it is the capstone. That's what we always already were geared towards. That's the connaturality. Now, if we are conceived in our mother's womb, that's of course not yet experiential, but there is an affinity because we already have that nature, that nature doesn't change. And so that's there from the beginning, but it is unfolding, and the levels of unfolding. And the unfolding would then include, of course, also reason and the forms of reason that inform us and therefore make us inclined, towards God in this case.
Thank you, all three of you. I had a question, just if we could say a little bit more about being and person and their relationship. So, Father Anselm, for you, how you would think about whether there's a priority of being or a person in God, or the simultaneity of the two, and then just more generally for the panel, I guess. How I am very sympathetic to the idea of sort of a personalism that detaches itself from metaphysics and from being simply in that result, it sort of becomes superficial and lost in its depth. But how do we sort of think? I mean, it seems to me that Thomas Aquinas, in his sense of, without using the term person, in his sense of spirit or reason, right, already has a lot of what you were describing, Father, in terms of secondary acts, but they're precisely as the very being of God. So just how we think about that.
Yeah, I mean, my German mind tries to get to the bottom of this and say, what's the problem here, or where are the divergences, or how can they go together? And I don't see at the end of the day that this needs to be a contrast. And so if one takes personal reality to be the ultimate paradigm of reality, I think that can work in a certain sense. The problem is to understand properly what personhood is. And for that, it needs a certain kind of, it needs some notion of analogy of being, of negative theology, all this needs to be part of it. And in fact, the notion of personhood emerged in that context. It was about Christology, the problem that you have, one person and two natures, and Trinity, so you have one nature and three persons. How to think about that? And it was immediately a theological context, and it was about the divine persons. And so there's all reason to ask, first of all, not to take for granted that we know what a person is. It takes a lot of reflection, and that reflection involves metaphysics, I think. And that doesn't put down the person or something like that. It's just the opposite, And so there's a certain dialectic perhaps going on, but it's not incompatible at all.
Within the tradition of philosophical reflection, you often get that contrast between the impersonal principle of the philosophers and the sense of the personal God in the monotheistic tradition in particular. And it could be claimed that, you know, in the philosophical tradition, we may love the absolute, but the absolute doesn't love us. You know, reflecting again that sense of the impersonal, whereas, say, within the Old Testament and the New, the personal engagement and promise of the divine is so absolutely central that they seem to be just on parallel tracks. One of the things that worries me about personalism is that it runs the risk of a too anthropocentric orientation, and this is echoing the whole question of what we actually understand by persons. That's a whole can of worms, of course. But rather than the impersonal, I would prefer to talk about the transpersonal. And in looking at person, and this is only just one thought, there are many thoughts that would be necessary. You have the notion of the prosopon, which is an optic view of the person. Someone like Richard Carney, for instance, particularly stresses that prosopon, and John Manusakis, just two people who are talking about the personal today. But I like actually the word person as personans, where the sonans has the ear, what one hears, what resounds through per, whereas the optic one has that sense of the mask behind which perhaps the true being is. So if person is personans, then you have that sense of a passage which may also be a passage to the transpersonal, in the sense, again, the word trans has that character of moving between here and there. Those are the directions that I would try to think of the personal God as transpersonal in that sense, in order to avoid a kind of personalism that is too anthropomorphic and too anthropocentrically reductive. Rather, it opens up the anthropos, so to say, through what passes through it, sounds in the person, communicates through the, not so much the mask now, but that place of opening. They're just some thoughts. In which? Well, again, I think within the philosophical tradition, the tendency has been to depersonalize being. I mean, whether that's right or wrong is another question. I think it's wrong in the sense that if you separate being and person, then you're, you know, the person properly understood can be seen as the kind of the acme or the epitome of what it means to be. And we as human beings, as persons, something of the fullest potential, perhaps even realized power of what it means to be comes to some manifestation in us. So the centrality of the human person, I think, is not to be denied at all. But it's a centrality which shouldn't be anthropomorphic in a reductive sense relative to the transcendence of the divine. But being, you know, I mean, this is a sympathetic space here where the notion of being can be used without incomprehension or hostility. But there are so many philosophical spaces where that is simply not the case. Generally speaking, in modern philosophy, being, I think there's been a voiding of being. It's been emptied out of any sense of this rich over-determinacy, as I would call it. And so in Hegel's logic, it's the emptiest and indeterminate concept. In Nietzsche, then, it's just the evaporating emptiness of an empty generality. And I think in some contemporary thinkers, being, so to say, flips into nothing because there's nothing there. It's already there preset to a certain extent in Hegel's logic. But this, if you look at some of the pre-moderns, that sense of over-determinacy as a certain too muchness, a certain surplus, and a dwelling within that, a participation within that surplus seems to me so evidently at work there. But for many in modernity, being is nothing. it's a neutral there-ness, or it's a kind of nothing, and we as human beings then have to somehow sort of bootstrap ourselves up into some significance in that evacuated being. So to recuperate that other sense of, I mean, I think we here, I sense that the sense of, our sense of being here is not that evacuated sense of being, but I think it's extremely widespread in Western modernity.
I mean, just one sentence. I mean, that too muchness of that rich sense of being. I mean, then the question is that disclosing something about the being of God? And is there something about the reciprocity of the mysteries of being and person and God that would allow you to recognize that aspect, which is not common, I think, and certainly not in modern philosophy. So, well, thank you very much.